Okay, this is a very impromptu recording, as Gravity Falls cannot leave my mind, and these two are the cause of it. I am absolutely smitten with the way that this show, these characters, and especially the recent Book of Bill is written. I literally have woken up in a cold sweat to write part of this on my notes app. It is just so good. So recently, the Book of Bill and Gravity Falls has had a bit of a resurgence and popularity amongst the masses. And I am but a sheeple. Actually, just kidding. I watched Gravity Falls growing up. I caught the episodes week after week. And I actually remember when the episodes were still airing and people were making theories about what was going to happen next. I remember the Mabeland debacle when everyone thought that it was going to be Her Perfect Day of Summer instead of a fancy schmancy 80s land, and then everyone got mad that it was predictable. Yeah. I recently rewatched the entire series after years of not seeing it or not really looking at it, and I loved it. I cried at the end. It was so good. But while Gravity Falls in its entirety is really good, something, or should I say someone, has piqued my interest quite a bit. Stanford Pines and Bill Cipher. Everyone is talking about them. Yada yada toxic yowie, yada yada he the triangle. It's all good and it's all fun. But I think that these two are really interesting, and there's a lot of potential of analysis that people are looking over. I mean, people have definitely talked about it. I'm not the first one to do anything, but if my annoying Tumblr rambles are anything to go off of, I have a lot of thoughts about these two, and I think that they can be summed up with 3 different sections for each character. Their compelling backstory, how that backstory informs their decisions, and the regret and denial they face after the fallout and the rest of their moments in the series. Also, quick content warning for toxic and abusive relationships. Mentions of suicide, bullying, coercion, nerdy old men, eldritch possession, destruction of 2-dimensional spaces, and evil triangles. Also, just as a heads up, I'm definitely going to put in some things I forgot to record as little notes on screen. If you're someone like me who likes listening to video essays but doesn't really watch them, just keep in mind that if something needs a little more context, it's probably on the screen. Also, I work hard on editing, so, maybe take a gander. But no pressure, because I also listen to things without watching them as well. The Book of Bill in general really impresses me because it's super cool to see what Alex Hirsch can do when he's not being held back by censors too much. I was reading this book and I was genuinely shocked that Ford started using the word damn. I was like, what? He can say that? And he started mentioning drinks and hangovers. I was like, what? I was not expecting that mature of a depiction of a toxic relationship to overtaking your life, and I wasn't expecting how great it was, the possession and fantastical nature of the book and the show, to be an allegory for a stressful and toxic relationship. I thought it was very cool. So let's start with Ford. Good old Fordsy. This man had a chokehold on me at age 13. I don't know what was going on there, but it hasn't changed at all. Side note, I played Swooning Over Stands, and I intended to play both routes, and then I played Ford's entire route with the pictures and everything, and then I started playing Stanley's, and I was like, I miss Ford's route, and then I didn't play it anymore. Listen, I think that Stanley is very hot in his own way. Everyone knows that scene in Karaoke, it did things to people, okay? His outfit in the other episode, was it Double Dipper? The outfit that he wears to the party. That outfit. I was screaming in my room when I watched that. But Ford has always had a special place in my heart. He was kind of annoying in some of the episodes because he's a nerd emoji, but overall, I really like him, and I've grown to like him more as I get older. His backstory in general is very, very compelling, and how that informs his decisions, and then his feelings after those decisions. it's very compelling, so let's talk about it. Ford had a few things that made him a bit different compared to the kids. For one thing, he had his 6 fingers, his feature that made him feel like an anomaly. And this is both stated as being freakish or weird by his peers, but also being propped up as a gift by doctors. We see this if you type Ford or Sixer or anything that describes Ford into the computer on This Is Not a Website. The doctor goes on saying, I'm not sure if this is a disability, it's almost like a super ability, which props up Ford as both weird and also different in a good way, which is a theme that Ford takes to heart and that we see throughout his arc. There's also an emphasis on his IQ, his smarts, his research, something that he is objectively good at. This is also weird and alienates him from his peers, but makes his parents and his school proud of him. This is something that he can control, that he is objectively good at. But growing up, there's also an emphasis on his lack of social skills. While he has other things that make him interesting and kind of weird and prop him up, there seems to be a direct correlation between this weirdness and his lack of social interaction and lack of social skills, which he really, really takes to heart as he grows up, describing marriage as almost a waste of time, settling down seeming as something baffling him. While I didn't grow up with 6 fingers or being really smart, I do relate to having trouble with social interactions because of any number of things, from weird mannerisms to not feeling like I fit in to some sort of neurodivergency. I relate to it, and I've had moments where, because you struggle with socializing, you feel like all you're good for is one thing that you're good at, which in this case was Ford's smarts and his book smarts. This combination of feeling like a total outcast, but also having a talent, informs Ford's personality. As Bill says in the Book of Bill, Ford had the ego of a king, the insecurity of a circus freak. And this went all the way to when he first met Bill, which was in his college/after college career. So Ford was in his mid to late 20s and still feeling like a total outcast, with no real friends or family other than maybe McGucket later on. But we know how that turned out, so... And we know that turned out that way because of his past and his compartmentalizing about his talents and also his crippling insecurity, especially with social situations. And Bill capitalizes on this. Society calls these people outcasts. I call them hench maniacs. And we see this isolation on this first lost journal page, almost like a prophecy of what's to come. Another day, another failed social interaction. Ford is in his mid to late 20s and still having trouble interacting with people. He feels like an outcast, but also knows that he's worth something else. And so he further isolates himself. It's something that's both incredibly sympathetic and also hard to talk about. Because, he was bullied and stuff, right? It's complicated, and that's one of the things that I really love about the Book of Bill. A part of Ford's character that we see throughout the series, especially in the Book of Bill and Journal 3, is Ford's struggles with his own attraction. We see this in 3 different distinct ways, whether he's talking about his attraction to strange things, an attraction to something that hurts someone, and also nightmares about attraction. In Journal 3, he talks about being attracted to strange things, and strange things are attracted to him. He expands on this with his Gravity Falls attraction to weirdness theory that he goes on about later. I think this has a very explicit double meaning. Obviously, Ford wants people to think that his attraction is specifically scientific, attracted as in drawn to, like a magnet, but throughout his specificity of attraction, it can be also read as romantic or even sexual. And I think this is a really cool way that they show how Ford wants to be purely scientific, but his need for connection kind of seeps into that. And I think this is connected to his relationship with Bill. Obviously, Bill is strange and he's seen as an anomaly and he's this weird eldritch being. And Ford is attracted to this, and the eldritch being is attracted to Ford. Either drawn to or even in a relationship way, as we see becomes more explicit throughout the Book of Bill. In the Book of Bill, Bill shows us what all of our main characters dream about, And Ford's is shown first, and I think it's really, really interesting. He says, Sixer dreams about a pop quiz that asks him, "What are you attracted to?" Usually writes, "I'm attracted to logic and preparation." And then Bill chimes in with, "Not sure what to call that, pansexual." And it's a little jab at Ford Z, but it also shows us that Ford is in extreme denial that he is worrying about things like attraction. And it's a pretty blatant show of him questioning and being frustrated with his own sexuality. I was actually surprised how blatant it was. He literally has nightmares about, like, what he's attracted to. I think this also shows Ford's denial and readiness to replace any sort of interest in attraction or sexuality with logic and objective research, as we can see throughout his life. We can see this again, Ford projecting almost onto the reader, describing a simple attraction to things that hurt you. And the previous things that he brings up are also things that relate to Ford, which leads me to believe he's projecting and telling the reader that he was attracted to things that hurt. And something we see in these lost pages especially are Ford's insecurities regarding social situations, which we already kind of knew. Ford says this line as well, which I feel like I can relate in some certain way. Is my strange way of seeing the universe a gift or a curse? Is loneliness just the cost of greatness? And if it is, how long am I fated to endure? And while we see Stanley's point of view of how he compares himself to his brother's smarts, we can see Ford compare himself to Stanley at the very bottom in the code. Stanley could have made her laugh. This is something that we don't see in the show a whole lot until the very end, where Ford admits that Stanley probably wouldn't have fallen for Bill, and he's right. Ford and Bill aren't good people, but we still feel for their experiences. At least I do. I definitely feel a lot more for Ford's, but Bill still has some interesting moments that we'll talk about soon enough. And we can see Ford's hubris finally come to pass when he meets Bill. Bill's backstory is so interesting, and it's done in a really cool way in the book. I am just so obsessed with media that gives little information and lets your imagination go wild. So in this show, Bill says, "I liberated my dimension, and I can liberate yours too," as we see a second dimension go up in flames, which is obviously horrifying. But we see from the book of Bill that it wasn't a tyrannical monstrosity that Bill had planned. He was an anomaly. He had one eye, already weird growing up, but he could also see the third dimension. He had a vision or a power that no one else could see, and he thought that he was destined for more. He grew up very similar to Stanford. He wanted to show his parents, the people that he loved, and his dimension, what he had seen as well. And on the next page, we see what happens. Bill starts with this very enthusiastic, "It was time to put on a show," and it slowly changes into their screams getting louder, so much blood, hands shaking, no one left but me, covered in blood, alone in the universe. And this is done with great characterization from Bill. During the book of Bill, we can see his denial and deflection of anything that shows his vulnerabilities. And this story is definitely one of his most vulnerable moments. And we can see that because almost all of it is blacked out. That's weird. For some reason, whenever I try to talk about that day, there's this loud buzzing in my ears and I black out for 30 seconds. It's done for comedic effect, but it's also incredibly interesting. This is another parallel between Stanford and Bill. They both deflect on their feelings. Bill says Sixer was a lot better at science than he was at making friends, and he tended to rip out journal pages that had anything to do with his issues with others, especially me. Ford is embarrassed of his own human emotions. He wants to focus on what he can do, what he can control, which is his research. And yet he still yearns for this social interaction. And Bill makes him feel seen. He praises him for his scientific research, and he also keeps him company. This beginning of their relationship is very haunting when you look back on what all has happened, because Ford genuinely enjoys Bill's company, my muse and me. I cannot believe how much he has enriched my life since. It's not just his uncanny predictions about the future. He's sped up my mind when it's sluggish, and calmed it down when I'm anxious. Given me clever comebacks when I'm insulted. This is another really interesting part of their relationship, as they seem to complete each other. Bill says this as well when he says, "Me and Sixer would be the perfect team. I had what he always wanted, charisma. And he had what I wanted, fingers. Which is interesting because of his anomaly with the 6 fingers, but it's also that Bill wants control. He wants to be tangible in the third dimension. There's a lot of psychological terms that are thrown around on the internet, so I don't want to use any of them too flippantly, but I think that Bill giving Ford basically everything he wants is a pretty blatant depiction of love bombing. And this is contrasted with Bill straight up just leaving Ford and making him feel empty. Then he'll disappear for weeks, months at a time, and I am left to wonder, has it all been in my head? And if it has, would that be enough? Totally isolated from anyone who might steer him clear of Bill's plans. Completely isolated from everyone and anyone, he finally meets an exciting and fun person who just gets him. But this also allows him to be whisked away into various destructive patterns and furthers him to feel strange and isolated. Bill makes him feel amazing, but also makes him feel different. But different in a good way, at least to Ford at this moment. Bill makes him feel special, but without Bill, he feels worthless. We can see this in one of the darkest moments in the book. One of the moments that really surprised me, blew me away with Alex Hirsch's writing. Bill says, Fordsy, nobody else really gets you, do they? Without me, you'll always feel unseen, surrounded by dolts who don't recognize your true potential. You've always felt alone in a crowd, haven't you? Who else will give you this feeling again? Even if you got rid of me, you'd miss me. Admit it, you'd miss me. And while this is a setup for an amazing punchline, it's also a great summary of why Ford is so addicted to Bill. Ford makes a deal with Bill. He can go in and out of his mind whenever he pleases. But the sanitized description of this relationship that we get in the show and Ford's genuine feelings on the matter are very different. There's more stuff that goes down between these two. Bill spells Ford's name in dead rats. They have this goofy karaoke night, which I was very surprised that drinking and hangovers were mentioned in a book that I presumably thought was published by Disney. I'm not quite sure about all that. It's always fun to see a more vulnerable side of Ford, and that's why these journal pages are so special to me. But even though Ford and Bill seem to be having a good time, this is still a red flag to me. Bill offers Ford a drink, and Ford politely declines. He says he's flattered, but he's not much of a drinker. And Bill says he'll convince him. This is coercion, right? Like this is really interesting, but also incredibly haunting. It's kind of up in the air if Bill really wants to show him a good time, and it's up in the air in general if Bill actually cared about Ford, something we'll talk about later. They talk about their respective pasts, Ford with his brother and Bill with his dimension. I love this part. The foreshadowing in Sixer, It Would Eat You Alive is incredible. Honestly, just go read the book. Bill also genuinely has a jealousy problem. It's pretty obvious that he's jealous of Fiddleford and Ford's relationship, which seemed very intimate, seeing as Fiddleford handcrafted 6-fingered gloves for Ford, as well as making him a miniature snow globe, and then forgot a present for his wife. And we can see Bill begin to try to sever any other relationship that Ford has besides him. Bill puts doubts into Ford's head about Fiddleford, saying that he's going to shut down their plans, he's keeping an eye on him. And this is in the middle of a particularly lonely moment Ford has, where Bill leaves for months on end. Where was he? Off inspiring some other scientist? Posing for some tapestry? Were we even partners? And then Bill says, I'm not the one skipping portal work to carouse with a third-wheel hillbilly with second thoughts about our project. And for dropping the snow globe and breaking it is just such good imagery for his relationships and ties being broken and how he should trust no one but Bill. I think this trust no one line is really interesting, and it hurts even more rewatching the series and seeing Dipper repeat it to himself like a mantra when it's what Ford's toxic ex basically told him to do so that he could keep him as his pawn. The double meaning of the term "I'm still on your mind" is so God, I need to stop using the word interesting. I sound like Gaster. The double meaning of the term "I'm still on your mind" is particularly pivotal in Gravity Falls and this storyline, as it's such a great allegory for becoming absolutely obsessed with something. The Eldritch being, Bill, is quite literally inside Ford's head, and quite literally possessing him to think of nothing but him. It's such a fascinating shorthand for a toxic relationship, someone taking advantage of a person who has lost so much and feels so alone. And at some of the darkest points in this story are when Ford is completely isolated. He had lost Fiddleford, he had lost Stan, and Bill was his only real connection. And Bill starts abusing this power over him in order to show him that he quite literally owns him. There's a lot of ownership talk happening, and it's used in both a literal sense of Bill being able to overtake and own Ford's body, and also used as, an allegory for a toxic abuser feeling like they own someone and have control over their life. And we see some haunting foreshadowing of this with a lot of Ford's tattoos that he gets during his relationship with Bill. Ford has a lot of history with tattoos that we see. When Bill and Ford first meet, Bill gets Ford to get a tattoo, basically saying property of Bill, and lies to Ford about the meaning. And then later, when Bill takes full advantage of Ford during one of his lowest moments, he gets another tattoo, which Ford is specifically disgusted with, and Bill knows he would be disgusted by this relationship isn't two-sided in an equal and fulfilling way, in a normal or a healthy way. Ford worships Bill, this eldritch being, in almost a religious way, as we can see throughout his shrine. And it's very similar to how someone in a relationship can become obsessed with someone else in a way where they put them on a pedestal, which is easily shown through this show and this story because Bill is literally a god, but Ford is a scientist. As we go throughout these lost journal pages, things get darker and darker, and we begin to see Bill's impact on Ford's life become more and more sinister. Throughout the book, we see Ford and Bill's relationship go from seemingly extraordinary to incredibly traumatic and horrifying, specifically from Ford's perspective, as these are the lost journal pages, which is why I've been emphasizing Ford's perspective during all of this, as it's what we have the most direct evidence for. And as the relationship spirals into something more horrifying, specifically from Ford's perspective, we can see throughout the journal pages his horror and humiliation. And this shame that Ford feels is something that's present throughout the Journal 3, the books, even the show to an extent. We see Ford go to some pretty extreme lengths to keep Bill out of his mind. As much as Bill can make Ford's life amazing towards the beginning, he also proves to Ford that he can make his life just as horrifying and awful. Much like a real-life abuser, Bill holds his power over Ford in a variety of different ways that we see throughout these lost journal pages. And they're some of the darkest moments I've ever seen in Gravity Falls, and I understand why Ford would feel the need to rip them out. When Ford decides to have his own agency and not do what Bill wanted him to after Bill betrays him, Bill goes through a variety of things from possessing corpses to leaving sticky notes on Ford's forehead to leaving a live snake in his journal. And in one of the most chilling pages, we see that Bill overtakes Ford's mind and leaves him on the top of his cabin, almost about to jump. A horrifying morning, and it was to send a message that he's his toy. And as Bill gets more and more frustrated with Ford, how Ford refuses to let him into the portal room, he overtakes Ford's mind and goes on a joyride in his body. He threatens to call his estranged brother and tell him that he's going to kill himself and that he never loved him. He uses the power over his brain that once helped him calm his anxiety or speed up his research to threaten to delete memories, to have him delete his memory of his own name. "You're my property, don't forget it. The hillbilly abandoned you, your father won't want you returning without millions, you have no friends, and if you died out here in the snow, who would even miss you?" Which is a shockingly realistic depiction of an abusive partner. And when Ford starts losing Bill, start receiving some of the worst of Bill's mistreatment and torture, he starts grasping at straws for any sort of ties that he had long abandoned and that Bill had succeeded in convincing him that he did not need. He feels like he has nothing else but Bill. And it's very tempting to view Bill as this sort of one-dimensional, awful abuser, right? I mean, the things that he was doing to Ford were objectively awful, and we don't see a lot of Bill's perspective throughout all of this. But we do see his perspective after the journal pages. And losing Ford, going on a drunken rampage to a taco place and asking for 1 sixer, and eventually breaking down and grabbing a woman's phone to call his mom, which is particularly sad because he is the one who had destroyed his dimension and his parents. Although we are taken out of this sadness as he goes to berating his mother for not cutting off the crusts of the sandwiches. Ford, on the other hand, reacts to this breakup with a determination to destroy Bill, but also an incredible shame and lack of trust of anyone. His experience with Bill had only strengthened his desire to isolate himself and trust no one. And we can see Bill's denial go into full gear as he's forced to confront these issues in the theraprism. So, for those who don't know, when Bill gets killed in the last episode of Gravity Falls, he summons the axolotl and convinces him to let him live. And convinces him to live is essentially the axolotl puts him in this therapy cube thing called the theraprism. And we actually get to see little snippets of Bill in therapy throughout thisisnotawebsite.com, which I found so cool and I ate it up. It was so fun. If you input "even his lies are lies" into the computer, it prompts a short exchange between Bill and what we can assume to be a therapist. And here we can see Bill talk about his experience with Ford. He continues to ramble on and on about Ford and ruminating on some sort of excuse on why he keeps thinking about Ford and why Ford matters to him. Like I had said previously, we can see this repeatedly in the Book of Bill when topics run close to Bill's own past and experiences, especially vulnerabilities. He works overtime to try to correct these. He goes on about Ford being a pawn, a perfect pawn even, and how he wants him to feel special so that he can take advantage of him. And the therapist keeps asking questions on and on about, is that all Ford was to you? Did you ever really care about him? Things that we, the audience, wonder as well. And while Bill continues to ramble on about Ford being a tool and a pawn, I feel that the computer prompt you put in to see this exchange, even his lies are lies, tell the truth. That Bill is an incredibly guarded individual who refuses to tell the truth about his vulnerabilities, even in something as intimate as therapy. And we see this pattern a lot throughout the book. We see it on the weaknesses page. His exes or feelings are brought up. And while he doesn't black anything out with his experience with falling out with Ford, we can definitely see that he tries to move along as quickly as possible. He keeps reaffirming that Ford would be back and he wasn't upset. And again, this is played for an incredibly goofy joke, but it's also incredibly in character. Knocking back a few cold glasses of I'm Fine juice, and then it shows this giant-ass pint that Bill is comedically holding up. Bill is fascinating because he's such an awful person, but he has hidden vulnerabilities. I never once wanted to root for Bill, but his story still means a lot. It still tugs at my heartstrings. I still feel so much sympathy for the idea of an awful falling out, even if the situation is much more horrific than what we as human beings feel. That otherworldly Lovecraftian feature to this allegory for a toxic relationship just makes it so interesting to me. When you type in "I'm still on your mind," something that Bill repeats after talking about Stanley for a very long time, footage plays on the computer of a stormy day at sea, and we can hear Stan in the background. So this is presumably from Ford's perspective. I think this is an interesting double, maybe even triple meaning of "I'm still on your mind," and Bill possibly still being on Grunkle Stan's mind. Literally, a play on Ford still thinking about Bill, either worrying or reminiscing. Not in a sense that he particularly regrets killing Bill, more of like a he's looking back on it and it's bittersweet, similar to the experience he had with Mabel regarding the funeral. Something a Tumblr user brought up while I was making this video seemed to fit in with my major thesis fairly well. In the Book of Bill, Bill has a like a foolproof way to get through any situation. He talks about the 3 ways you can get through it: denial, rationalization, and detachment, which is a pretty blatant coping mechanism that him and Ford both share. Rob Renzetti also talks about Ford rationalizing everything that he can, such as the cheap plastic case thing. And I think a lot of Ford's growth comes from rejecting these ideas that him and Bill shared. Denial, rationalization, and detachment. He rejects the denial that Bill's whole situation happened and that it was bad. He rejects rationalizing his awful treatment of Fiddleford and his obsessions with Bill overtaking his life. And he rejects detachment from those around him. We can see Ford's growth throughout Journal 3 and the Book of Bill, how he overcomes his shame and humiliation regarding this experience, how he sees Bill for who he really is, someone who is incredibly insecure and has an extremely large ego that he wants to pull others down into. And we see how he reconnects with his external support system, learning to trust others again, learning to have faith in the future generation, to give other people credit, and to make connections. While we see Bill succumb to his isolation and insistence that he doesn't need anybody, that he doesn't need Ford, basically. And we see Bill succumbing to this denial throughout the last pages of the Book of Bill. We see him shattered and clearly traumatized, but continuously repeating, "I'm fine." Bill is an over-exaggerated and tyrannical monster, but he's also an incredibly well-written analogy of someone with a horrible past who doesn't break the chain. I think that Gravity Falls has a huge theme of generational trauma being broken by the next generation. We see it with the Pines twins, the Dipper and Mabel. We see it with Pacifica. We see it with Seuss. Pretty much every character has some sort of strain in their family or past that they're able to overcome and learn and grow from. Even Dipper and Mabel teach Ford and Stan new things about themselves, despite being so young. But Bill doesn't. He's had this horrible experience growing up, and yet he never grows or learns or chooses to be something different. He's an anomaly, and he's going to act like the anomaly that people see him as. Bill is not redeemable to me. I just can't stop thinking about why he does what he does and what he truly feels. Bill is an awful, awful person, and he was incredibly abusive to Ford. But I think the nuance of Bill caring about Ford still, so much that he goes on a drunken rampage when they break up, is fascinating. And not to defend Bill in any way, but I do think part of this conversation includes Bill being an eldritch monster. He also expresses things like pain being amusing to him, and also experiencing time differently. This 30 years of Ford dedicating himself to destroying Bill was like a weekend to Bill of his ex ghosting him. And I think this distance between the reality of the abusive situation and also the comedy that is sprinkled in makes this story really engaging and also fairly easy to digest, especially for younger viewers. This is a fascinating and complex relationship, but also Bill is a comedic character. He's a lovable character. I think these two are endlessly fascinating, and there's a lot of nuance between both of them. Welcome to the end of the video! I did it! I saved the town. Joke. That was a joke. The real ones understand, and I hope you're not a real one. This is a very impromptu video. I literally woke up in a cold sweat and was like, I need to record this. Partially because I felt like there wasn't enough discussion on the tragic aspect and homoerotic aspect of these two in video essays specifically. I hope it was fun to listen to, even if it was a little bit rambly at times. Hopefully, by the time that you've seen this, I've edited it into something that makes sense. I plan to make more videos in the future. I've been toiling away at an animated commentary video. The audio has been completely done for like forever. Mostly just the animation and the timing that's been keeping it up. I'm sure I'll make it eventually, but this was definitely an easier task for me to handle, having just still sprites and some small editing here and there. It also helps that I've got like major Gravity Falls brain rot right now, as opposed to the other videos topic I've been less interested in as the months go on. I almost wonder if I should like edit together a less animated and just complete version of that video just to have something, because I feel like if I think about animating it too much and I spend too much time on it, it's never going to come out. And I would like to keep making videos, and I don't want to keep being held up by videos that I plan to make or plan to finish. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed my cool, epic commentary, and have a great rest of your epic day. Also, quick content warning for toxic and abusive relationships, gay people.